When Officer Sarah Mitchell pulled over by Franklin Heights High School that autumn afternoon, she thought she was following just another protocol, one more routine stop, one more suspect description, one more by-the-book interaction. She didn't know that the next few minutes would shatter everything she thought she knew about being a cop and set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her life, but an entire community. Officer Sarah Mitchell pulled her patrol car to a slow stop outside Franklin Heights High School, where clusters of students were making their way home on a crisp autumn afternoon. After 15 years on the force in the small town of Millbrook, she thought she'd seen it all. But something about today felt different. Her attention was drawn to a tall, lanky teenager in a navy blue hoodie, walking with quick, purposeful strides away from the school's main entrance. The dispatch call had been clear. A convenience store 2 blocks away had reported a shoplifting incident involving a young African-American male in a blue hoodie. The description matched, but something about this situation made Sarah's stomach knot up. The girl, she could see now it was a girl, had her hood pulled up despite the mild weather, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Sarah had learned to read body language over her years of service, and everything about this teenager's posture spoke of worry, not guilt. Following protocol, Sarah stepped out of her vehicle. "Excuse me, miss, could you stop for a moment?" The girl froze mid-stride, her whole body tensing. Slowly she turned around, and Sarah saw her face for the first time. She couldn't have been more than 16, with deep brown eyes that held both fear and defiance. A name tag from what appeared to be a fast food restaurant uniform peeked out from beneath her hoodie. "Is there a problem, officer?" The girl's voice was steady, but Sarah noticed her hands trembling slightly as she pulled down her hood. "I'm Officer Mitchell. There was an incident reported nearby, and I'm just following up. Could you tell me your name?" "Jasmine Turner," the girl replied, her chin lifting slightly. "I'm heading to work. I can't be late again, or they'll fire me." Sarah noticed a small stack of books clutched tightly against Jasmine's chest. Advanced placement textbooks. This detail didn't fit the profile of their suspect, but procedure was procedure. "Would you mind if I asked where you were about 20 minutes ago?" "I was in the library with Mrs. Henderson's AP study group. We're preparing for midterms." Jasmine's voice cracked slightly. "You can ask her. Please, I really need to get to work. My mom's sick, and I can't lose this job." Sarah studied the girl's face, thinking about her own daughter at home, just a few years younger than Jasmine. The weight of the badge on her chest felt particularly heavy today. In her mind, she could hear the voices of her fellow officers. "Follow protocol. Don't let them talk their way out of it. Trust your training." But there was something else too, the voice of her father, also a police officer, who had taught her that being a good cop meant looking beyond the surface, seeing the human being behind every interaction. "Which restaurant do you work at?" Sarah asked, her tone softening slightly. "Burger Basin on 5th Street, Jasmine answered. "I work the closing shift 4 nights a week. Been there 6 months now." She shifted her weight, glancing anxiously at her watch. "My manager, Mr. Rodriguez, he can verify everything. I've never been in trouble, officer. I'm trying to save up for college. I have a 4.2 GPA. Behind them, the school doors opened, and Mrs. Henderson, a gray-haired woman Sarah recognized from the community events, emerged with a stack of papers. The teacher's eyes widened with recognition as she saw the scene unfolding. "Officer Mitchell?" Mrs. Henderson called out, hurrying down the steps. "Is everything all right?" Sarah remained focused on Jasmine, noticing the way the girl's shoulders had begun to shake slightly, though she was clearly trying to maintain her composure. Other students were starting to gather at a distance, phones appearing in hands, and Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on them. The situation was escalating in ways she hadn't intended. Sarah thought about the real shoplifter, who was likely long gone by now, and about this girl in front of her. A girl who reminded her so much of her own daughter's determination to succeed. A car horn honked in the distance, and Sarah noticed Jasmine jump slightly at the sound. The girl's eyes were beginning to glisten with unshed tears, but there was something else in them too, a fierce determination that spoke of countless obstacles already overcome. "My little brother," Jasmine said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's waiting for me to pick him up from middle school before I go to work. He's only 11. He can't be there alone." Sarah felt the familiar tension between protocol and humanity, between the letter of the law and its spirit. In her 15 years on the force, she'd learned that these moments, these seemingly small decisions, were often the ones that mattered most. Mrs. Henderson had nearly reached them now, her face etched with concern. Other teachers were emerging from the building, drawn by the growing crowd of students. The autumn wind picked up, scattering leaves across the schoolyard, and Sarah could feel the situation teetering on a knife's edge. In her earpiece, dispatch crackled with an update about the shoplifting suspect. Sarah kept her expression neutral as she listened, even as her mind raced through the implications of what she was hearing. The real suspect had apparently been caught at a different location, but this moment with Jasmine had already set something bigger in motion. Jasmine stood perfectly still, her AP books clutched to her chest like a shield, waiting for whatever came next. The name tag on her uniform caught the afternoon light. Jasmine T., crew leader. The growing crowd of students had their phones raised, recording everything. Sarah knew that whatever she did next would likely end up on social media within minutes. But for once, that thought didn't guide her actions. Instead, she thought about the story that would unfold after the cameras stopped rolling. The story of a young girl trying to hold her family together, of a community that could either build bridges or burn them. The autumn wind continued to blow, carrying with it the sound of distant sirens and the weight of countless similar encounters that had ended differently. Sarah took a deep breath, aware that her next words would matter more than she could possibly know. "Jasmine," Sarah said softly, letting her official tone drop away. "Would you mind if I gave you and your brother a ride to your workplace?" The question hung in the air, unexpected and heavy with meaning. The crowd of students fell silent, phones still recording, but forgotten in hands that had gone slack with surprise. Jasmine's eyes widened, tears threatening to spill over. What? "Your brother shouldn't be waiting alone," Sarah continued, "and you shouldn't be late for work. I'd like to help, if you'll let me." Mrs. Henderson had reached them now, placing a protective hand on Jasmine's shoulder. "Officer Mitchell, Jasmine is one of our brightest students. She's been leading our peer tutoring program for—" "I know," Sarah interrupted gently. "I can see that." She gestured to Jasmine's books, her name tag, the quiet dignity with which she held herself. "Sometimes we need to look closer to see what's really in front of us." The tension in the air began to shift, transforming into something else entirely. A few students lowered their phones, though others continued recording, perhaps sensing that they were witnessing something worth remembering. "But," Jasmine swallowed hard, "I don't understand. Aren't you going to—" "Going to what?" Sarah asked, allowing a small smile to cross her face. "Help a hard-working student get to work on time? That's exactly what I'm going to do." The first tear finally escaped, rolling down Jasmine's cheek. She quickly wiped it away with her sleeve, but more followed. "Nobody's ever— usually when police—" Sarah felt her own throat tighten. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. But today can be different. Today is different." She reached for her car's back door, opening it with a gesture that somehow felt more significant than any other action she'd taken while wearing her badge. "Let's go get your brother. What's his name?" "Marcus," Jasmine replied, her voice steadying slightly. "He's probably scared right now, waiting alone." As they walked toward the patrol car, Sarah noticed the crowd of students parting, their expressions a mix of confusion, hope, and lingering suspicion. She heard the whispers, saw the text messages being typed furiously into phones. By tomorrow, this would be all over social media, but not for the reasons anyone had initially expected. Jasmine hesitated at the car door, then turned to face Sarah fully. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why are you doing this?" It was the question Sarah had been asking herself since the moment she'd first stepped out of her car. The answer came to her not as a police officer, but as a human being who had seen too many moments like this end differently. Because sometimes the best way to serve and protect is to see the person in front of you, really see them. And what I see is a young woman who deserves support, not suspicion. As they drove to the middle school, Sarah learned more about Jasmine's life, her mother's chronic illness that kept her from working regularly, the 2 jobs Jasmine juggled while maintaining her GPA, the dreams of medical school that seemed impossibly distant but refused to fade. Marcus was indeed waiting anxiously when they arrived, his small frame tense with worry, until he saw his sister. His fear at the sight of the police car transformed into confusion when Jasmine explained the situation. During the drive to Burger Basin, Sarah's radio occasionally crackled with routine calls, but she remained focused on the conversation unfolding in her car. Marcus, initially quiet, began to open up about his own school day, his voice growing animated as he described a science project he was working on. They pulled into the restaurant parking lot 5 minutes before Jasmine's shift was set to begin. But Sarah knew their story wasn't ending here. It was merely taking a turn she hadn't anticipated when she'd first spotted that blue hoodie leaving the school grounds. As Jasmine gathered her things to head inside, Sarah reached for her business card, then hesitated. What she was about to offer went beyond protocol, beyond the ordinary boundaries between officer and civilian. But sometimes, she realized, those boundaries needed to be re-examined. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Sarah made a decision that would alter not just this moment, but many moments to come. The restaurant's neon sign flickered to life above them, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to toll, marking the hour, and perhaps, though they didn't know it yet, the beginning of something extraordinary. "Here's my personal cell number," Sarah said, scribbling on the back of her card. "Not just the official one. If you or Marcus ever need anything, a ride, help with homework, or just someone to talk to, you call me, day or night." Jasmine stared at the card as if it might dissolve in her hands. "But why would you—" "Because change starts with one person reaching out to another," Sarah replied. "And because I have a feeling about you, Jasmine. You're going to do important things." Mr. Rodriguez, Jasmine's manager, had come to the door, curiosity evident on his face at the sight of a police car in his parking lot. His expression softened when Jasmine quickly explained the situation. "Officer Mitchell," he said, nodding respectfully. "Jasmine's one of my best employees. Whatever you might have heard—" "I've heard everything I need to know," Sarah interrupted gently. "In fact, I was wondering if we could talk about something. Would you have a minute after Jasmine's shift?" That evening, as Sarah sat in her patrol car writing her daily report, she found herself adding details she'd never included before. She wrote about Jasmine's GPA, about Marcus's science project, about the way communities could fracture or heal based on simple moments of choice. Over the next few weeks, a subtle transformation began to take place in Millbrook. It started small. Sarah would stop by Burger Basin during her patrol, not to check up on Jasmine, but to demonstrate her support. Other officers noticed. Questions were asked. Conversations began. Marcus's science project, it turned out, focused on environmental impacts on local communities. Sarah found herself helping him gather data, introducing him to the department's environmental crimes unit. His eyes would light up every time she shared a new piece of information. Word spread through the high school. Students who had recorded that first encounter began to share a different kind of police story. Some of Sarah's fellow officers were skeptical, others curious, but none could deny the ripple effects they were witnessing. One rainy Tuesday, Sarah received a call from Jasmine. Her mother had taken a turn for the worse, and she was struggling to balance hospital visits with work and school. Without hesitation, Sarah reached out to her network, other officers, their spouses, community leaders who owed her favors. Within days, a support system emerged. Mrs. Henderson organized a tutoring schedule that allowed Jasmine to maintain her grades while spending time at the hospital. Mr. Rodriguez adjusted her work hours. Officer Wilson's wife, a nurse at the hospital, kept a special eye on Mrs. Turner. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some of Sarah's colleagues questioned her involvement, suggesting she was becoming too personally invested. The department's old guard mumbled about maintaining professional distance. Yet Sarah noticed that even some of the skeptics began to approach their community interactions differently. One evening, as Sarah helped Marcus with his homework while Jasmine worked her shift, she received a call from the chief. A community organization had reached out to the department, interested in developing a new youth outreach program. They'd heard about what was happening at Burger Basin. "They're asking for you to lead it, Mitchell," the chief said, his tone unreadable. "Say the word, and we'll make it official." Sarah watched through the restaurant window as Jasmine efficiently managed her crew, her confidence growing day by day. In the booth beside her, Marcus sketched out ideas for expanding his science project into a community-wide initiative. The sun was setting over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of promise as Sarah considered her response. She thought about that first encounter outside the school, about all the similar moments happening across the country that ended differently, about how change really happens, not through grand gestures, but through persistent small acts of human connection. Her radio crackled with another call, but for a moment she remained still, watching the future unfold in unexpected ways before her. The weight of her badge felt different now, not lighter exactly, but more purposeful. In her mind, a new story was taking shape, one that expanded far beyond the autumn afternoon when she'd first stopped her patrol car outside Franklin Heights High. The restaurant's dinner rush was picking up, and Sarah could see Jasmine moving with practiced efficiency behind the counter. Through the window, their eyes met briefly, and Jasmine's smile carried the weight of everything that had changed, and everything that was still changing. "I'll do it," Sarah told the chief, her voice firm. "But I want Jasmine involved in the planning. She knows what these kids need better than any of us." The youth program took shape over the following months, evolving into something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. What started as simple mentorship expanded into a comprehensive support system, tutoring, job training, and a bridge between law enforcement and the community's young people. Jasmine's role grew alongside the program. Despite her busy schedule, she found time to attend the planning meetings, her insights proving invaluable. Her presence alone changed the dynamics. Officers who might have been skeptical found themselves listening to a teenager explain the realities of growing up in their community. One particularly memorable evening, during a community forum, Jasmine stood before a packed auditorium. Her voice, once hesitant, now carried with authority as she shared her story. In the audience, Sarah noticed several of her fellow officers shifting uncomfortably as Jasmine described her initial fear during their first encounter. "But that day showed me something different was possible," Jasmine continued, her eyes finding Sarah's in the crowd. "It showed me that change isn't just about policies or programs. It's about people choosing to see each other differently." The program's success began attracting attention from neighboring districts. News crews started showing up at events, eager to document what they called the Millbrook model. Sarah found herself fielding calls from departments across the state, all wanting to know their secret. But amid the growing attention, challenges remained. Not everyone supported the changes. Anonymous complaints were filed about Sarah's lack of professional distance. Some officers resisted the new training protocols that emerged from the program. And Jasmine, despite her achievements, still encountered moments of prejudice that no amount of progress seemed able to completely erase. Mrs. Turner's health continued to be a concern, though the support network around the family had grown stronger. Marcus, now in 8th grade, had become a regular fixture at the police station's community room, where he worked on an expanded version of his environmental project with a group of equally passionate students. One day, as Sarah was helping Marcus organize data for his project, Jasmine burst into the room, clutching an envelope. Her hands were shaking, but this time with excitement rather than fear. "It came," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "The letter from Stanford." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. They'd spent countless hours working on college applications, with Jasmine refusing to let her circumstances limit her dreams. The entire department had pitched in for application fees, and Mrs. Henderson had spent weekends helping with essays. The envelope remained unopened as Jasmine looked around the room. Marcus had stopped his work, watching his sister with wide eyes. Through the window, Sarah could see several officers pausing their activities, aware that something significant was happening. "Whatever it says," Sarah began, but Jasmine shook her head. "No matter what, we've already changed things," she said firmly. "This isn't just about me anymore." She was right. Sarah thought about all the other Jasmines out there, all the crucial moments of choice that happened every day on streets across America. The envelope in Jasmine's hands represented more than just one student's potential future. It symbolized what could happen when communities chose to transform fear into understanding. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the community room, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, the sounds of the city continued. Patrol cars rolling past, radio calls being answered, lives intersecting in countless ways. But in that moment, time seemed to pause as Jasmine's fingers moved to break the seal on the envelope. The air grew thick with anticipation as the paper crinkled under her trembling fingers. Whatever the letter contained, Sarah knew their story was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it felt like they were still just beginning. Jasmine's acceptance letter to Stanford became a symbol of possibility in Millbrook. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, not just about her achievement, but about the journey that had led to it. The photo they chose showed Jasmine in her Burger Basin uniform, surrounded by police officers, teachers, and community members who had become her extended family. But success brought its own challenges. As Jasmine's story spread, she began receiving messages from other young people across the country, each sharing similar experiences, each looking for hope. The weight of their expectations sometimes left her overwhelmed. "I don't know if I can be what they need me to be," she confided to Sarah one evening as they sat in the patrol car during Sarah's dinner break. "Everyone's watching now, waiting for me to mess up." Sarah turned to face her, seeing both the confident young woman she'd become and the scared teenager she'd first met. "You don't have to be perfect, Jasmine. You just have to be real." The scholarship covered tuition, but there were still gaps to fill. The community rallied again, organizing fundraisers that brought together unlikely allies. Sarah watched as former skeptics on the force worked alongside community activists they had once viewed with suspicion, all united in their determination to help Jasmine succeed. Marcus, too, was transforming. His environmental project had evolved into a youth-led initiative that was gaining citywide attention. Police officers found themselves partnering with middle school students to collect data on environmental violations, creating connections that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Mrs. Turner's health stabilized enough for her to attend community meetings, where her quiet dignity and unwavering support for her children earned her deep respect. She began counseling other parents, helping them navigate the complex relationships between their children and law enforcement. As summer approached and Jasmine's graduation neared, Sarah faced her own crossroads. The success of their program had led to opportunities, speaking engagements, consulting offers from larger departments. But something kept her rooted in Millbrook, aware that their work was far from complete. One warm evening, while helping Jasmine sort through college preparation lists, Sarah received an urgent call. A situation was unfolding at a local convenience store. Another teenager, another misunderstanding, another moment of potential conflict. "Go," Jasmine said, understanding immediately. "Show them what's possible." Sarah arrived at the scene to find a familiar tableau, a young black teenager, a suspicious store owner, mounting tension. But this time, she wasn't alone. Other officers who had been through their program were already there, approaching the situation with new eyes. As she stepped out of her car, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Her badge gleamed in the evening light. But it wasn't the symbol of authority that gave her strength now. It was everything she'd learned since that autumn day outside Franklin Heights High. The situation at the store de-escalated quickly, not through force or fear, but through the application of everything their community had learned. The teenager, it turned out, was an aspiring artist who had been sketching the store's vintage neon sign. Before the night was over, the store owner was discussing the possibility of commissioning a mural. Later, filling out her report, Sarah received a text from Jasmine, a picture of her younger brother surrounded by college brochures. "Marcus says he wants to study environmental law," the message read. "Says somebody needs to help communities fight back legally when they're being poisoned." Sarah smiled, remembering the scared 11-year-old who had once waited alone outside his middle school. Now, he was dreaming of changing systems from within, just as his sister was preparing to do. The next morning brought news that their program was being studied by a major civil rights organization. They wanted to understand how a chance encounter between a white police officer and a black teenager had sparked such significant change. But as Sarah sat in her patrol car, watching the sun rise over Millbrook, she knew the real story wasn't in the official reports or academic studies. It was in the thousands of small moments that had followed, the choices made, the bridges built, the trust earned step by difficult step. Her radio crackled with the day's first call. Somewhere in Millbrook, another story was waiting to unfold, another opportunity to choose connection over confrontation, understanding over fear. As she put her car in drive, Sarah thought about all the lives that intersected with hers, all the potential for change that existed in each encounter. The morning light caught the edges of buildings, casting long shadows across empty streets that would soon fill with life. Another day was beginning in Millbrook, and with it, the chance to continue what they'd started. As summer drew to a close, preparations for Jasmine's departure to Stanford intensified. The police department organized a farewell celebration that brought together the entire community. The parking lot of Burger Basin transformed into an impromptu gathering space, with officers grilling burgers while kids from the youth program shared their own stories of transformation. Mr. Rodriguez surprised everyone by announcing a scholarship program in Jasmine's name, funded jointly by local businesses and the Police Benevolent Association, for other young employees pursuing higher education. The first recipient would be selected the following spring. But beneath the celebration, Sarah sensed Jasmine's growing anxiety. Late one night, after her final shift at the restaurant, Jasmine asked Sarah to drive her past Franklin Heights High School. "I keep thinking about that day," Jasmine said quietly as they parked in the now empty lot. "What if you had been different? What if I had reacted differently? Everything could have gone another way." Sarah considered this, remembering her own uncertainties that autumn afternoon. "Maybe that's why we have to keep telling this story," she replied, "because there are still so many moments like that happening every day." The summer's headlines had proven that truth. More incidents across the country, more moments where fear overwhelmed humanity. Each new story hit Jasmine hard, as if she carried the weight of all those unnamed teenagers on her shoulders. Marcus had thrown himself into planning a going-away project, a comprehensive report on environmental racism in their county, combining his scientific research with testimonies from community members. The police department's environmental crimes unit had provided data, lending official credibility to his findings. "I'm worried about leaving him," Jasmine confessed. "About leaving Mom. About leaving all of this when there's still so much work to do." Sarah understood the fear behind these words. The program they had built together was still evolving, still fragile in some ways. But she also saw how it had taken root in unexpected places. Officer Jensen, once among the most skeptical of their initiatives, now ran regular basketball games with local teens. Detective Rivera had started a mentoring program specifically for young Latina girls interested in law enforcement. The changes were small but significant, rippling outward in ways they couldn't fully measure. As the departure date approached, Sarah received an unexpected call from the State Police Academy. They wanted her to develop a training module based on the Millbrook model. It would become required learning for all new recruits in the state. "They want you to come tell your story too, Jasmine," Sarah said during one of their final planning sessions. "When you're home on break." Jasmine looked up from the college paperwork spread across Sarah's kitchen table. "Our story," she corrected. "It's not just mine anymore." The truth of those words struck Sarah deeply. What had begun as a single moment of choice had grown into something larger than either of them. A testament to the possibility of change, even in a world that often seemed resistant to it. Mrs. Turner's health had stabilized enough for her to take a part-time job at a local community center, where she coordinated support services for other families facing similar challenges. Her quiet strength had become another thread in the complex tapestry of their story. The night before Jasmine was set to leave for California, Sarah found herself parked outside the convenience store where everything had started. The young artist's mural now covered one wall, a vibrant depiction of community unity that had become something of a local landmark. Her radio crackled with routine calls, but her mind was on the following morning when she would join the Turner family for the drive to the airport. They had all changed so much since that first encounter, yet in some ways, they were still the same people making the same crucial choice: to see each other's humanity, to believe in the possibility of something better. As she pulled away from the convenience store, Sarah noticed a group of teenagers watching her patrol car. But their expressions weren't fearful or hostile. They waved, recognizing her from the community programs. One girl, about Jasmine's age, gave a particularly enthusiastic greeting. These small moments, Sarah realized, were where real change lived, not in grand gestures or policy documents, but in the daily choices to reach across divides that seemed uncrossable. The stars were emerging above Millbrook as Sarah continued her patrol, each light a reminder of all the stories yet to unfold, all the moments of choice still waiting to happen. The morning of Jasmine's departure dawned clear and bright. Sarah arrived at the Turner home early, finding Marcus already on the porch with his sister's luggage, solemnly checking off items on a list he'd made. Inside, Mrs. Turner was trying to pack one last container of home-cooked food into an already overflowing carry-on bag. "Mom, they have food in California," Jasmine laughed, but her voice caught slightly. The enormity of the change ahead seemed to fill the small house. Sarah noticed how Jasmine's hand lingered on each familiar object. The worn kitchen table where she'd studied late into the night. The wall of family photos that now included several from police department events. The window where she'd watched for Sarah's patrol car on difficult days. The drive to the airport wasn't just family. A small convoy had formed. Officer Jensen's cruiser led the way, followed by Mrs. Henderson's sedan carrying several of Jasmine's former teachers. Mr. Rodriguez and a group of Burger Basin employees brought up the rear, their cars decorated with Stanford colors. At a stoplight, Sarah glanced in her rearview mirror at Jasmine, who sat between her mother and brother in the back seat. The girl who had once tensed at the sight of a police car was now surrounded by officers who had become family, her story permanently intertwined with theirs. The airport terminal was crowded with morning travelers, but a space seemed to clear naturally around their group. Sarah watched as Jasmine hugged each person goodbye, accepting letters, small gifts, and whispered words of encouragement. Marcus held on the longest, his face pressed into his sister's shoulder. "I'm going to make our environmental project national," he promised fiercely. "By the time you graduate, everybody's going to know about it." Mrs. Turner's goodbye was quiet but profound, mother and daughter holding each other as if memorizing the moment. When they separated, both were crying, but their tears held pride as well as sadness. Finally, Jasmine turned to Sarah. They stood facing each other, neither speaking at first, both aware of how unlikely their friendship would have seemed that autumn day outside Franklin Heights High. "I don't know how to say goodbye," Jasmine admitted softly. "Then don't," Sarah replied. "This isn't an ending, Jasmine. It's just a new chapter." They embraced, and Sarah felt the weight of everything they'd built together, the programs that would continue, the lives they'd touched, the changes they'd set in motion. When they pulled apart, Jasmine's eyes were bright with tears, but also determination. "Keep an eye on Marcus for me?" she asked, though they both knew the entire department had already unofficially adopted him. "Always," Sarah promised. "And Jasmine, remember what I told you that first day? You're going to do important things." As Jasmine walked toward the security checkpoint, she turned back one last time. The morning sun through the terminal windows caught her face, and for a moment, Sarah saw both the scared teenager in a blue hoodie and the confident young woman she'd become. The group lingered until Jasmine disappeared from view, then slowly began to disperse. Mrs. Turner and Marcus accepted a ride home from Mrs. Henderson, while the other officers returned to their patrols. Sarah remained for a moment, watching planes take off into the clear blue sky. Her radio crackled with a call, a situation developing at a local high school. Another moment of potential conflict or connection awaited. As she headed toward her car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine. "Thank you for seeing me." Those simple words carried the weight of their entire journey. Sarah clicked on her lights and pulled out of the airport parking lot, aware that somewhere in the city, another story was waiting to begin. The morning traffic parted before her cruiser as she headed toward the high school. Above, a plane climbed into the sky, carrying Jasmine toward her future while leaving ripples of change behind in Millbrook. The call at the high school turned out to be more significant than Sarah expected. A new student, a young black girl named Trinity, had been accused of cheating on a test by a substitute teacher who hadn't bothered to check her academic record. The situation was escalating, with other students recording on their phones and tension building in the hallway. As Sarah walked into the school, she heard whispers. "That's Officer Mitchell, the one from Jasmine's story." Trinity stood with her back against the lockers, tears streaming down her face, but her chin held high. A pose so reminiscent of Jasmine that Sarah's heart clenched. The girl's advanced calculus textbook was clutched to her chest like a shield. She couldn't have known those answers, the substitute teacher was insisting to the principal. They were college-level problems. Sarah stepped forward, but before she could speak, a familiar voice rang out. Actually, she could. Marcus Turner pushed through the crowd, his middle school visitor's badge prominent on his chest. He'd been there for a meeting about expanding his environmental project to the high school. "Trinity's been helping me with my advanced math. She's probably smarter than half the teachers here." The substitute teacher flushed red. "This doesn't concern you." "But it does," Sarah interjected quietly. "This concerns all of us." She turned to Trinity. "Would you be willing to solve another problem, right now, in front of everyone?" Trinity wiped her tears with the back of her hand and nodded. The principal, who had been watching silently, stepped forward with a piece of chalk. The crowd of students parted as Trinity walked to the hallway's blackboard, her hands steady as she began to work through an equation even more complex than the test problems. As she wrote, Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Jasmine, who had just landed in California. Made it safe, missing home already. Sarah looked at Trinity, still working confidently at the board, then at Marcus standing protectively nearby, and finally at her own badge reflecting in the fluorescent lights. She typed back, "Home misses you too, but your legacy is already growing." Trinity finished the problem with a flourish, her solution elegant and undeniably correct. The substitute teacher had gone pale, but Sarah wasn't interested in humiliation. She was interested in change. "I think," she said carefully, "we all need to have a conversation about assumptions and opportunities. Trinity, would you be interested in joining our youth leadership program? We could use someone with your mathematical skills." The girl's eyes widened. "The program Jasmine Turner started?" "The very one," Sarah confirmed. "And I believe Mr. Rodriguez at Burger Basin is still looking for part-time help, if you're interested in following another of Jasmine's paths." The crowd began to disperse, the immediate drama resolved, but Sarah knew this was just another beginning. As she helped Trinity gather her books, she noticed Marcus showing the principal his latest environmental data, his confidence growing with each passing day. Her radio crackled again. Another call, another opportunity. But before she left, she handed Trinity her card, complete with her personal number on the back. "Anytime," she said, echoing words she'd spoken months ago to another bright young woman, day or night. Outside, the autumn wind was picking up, scattering leaves across the parking lot. Sarah could almost imagine Jasmine's plane still visible somewhere in the vast sky, carrying her toward new challenges and opportunities. But here on the ground, in the hallways and streets of Millbrook, their shared story continued to unfold. The sound of Trinity's chalk on the blackboard had faded, but its echoes would ripple outward, joining the countless other moments that were slowly, steadily changing their world. That evening, as Sarah completed her shift, her phone lit up with a series of photos from Jasmine, her Stanford dorm room, her new roommate, the sprawling campus that would be her home for the next 4 years. The final image was of Jasmine holding up her old Burger Basin name tag against the California sunset. "Never forgetting where I came from," the caption read, or "Who helped me get here." Sarah sat in her patrol car, composing her response, when another text came through, this one from Trinity's mother, thanking her for her intervention at the school. The message ended with a question about the youth leadership program, and Sarah smiled, recognizing the familiar patterns of change spreading outward. Her inbox was full of similarly hopeful messages. Mr. Rodriguez reporting that Trinity had aced her job interview. Marcus sharing exciting news about a state-level environmental conference interested in his research. Mrs. Henderson detailing plans to implement new cultural sensitivity training for substitute teachers. As she drove through the darkening streets of Millbrook one last time before heading home, Sarah passed the convenience store, where their story had almost taken a different turn. The mural on its wall glowed softly in her headlights, a testament to what was possible when people chose to see beyond their preconceptions. Her radio crackled with the day's final call. A group of teenagers gathered in the park after hours. A year ago, such a call might have ended very differently. But as Sarah pulled up to the park, she recognized several faces from their youth program. They were practicing for a community talent show, using the park's lighting because they had nowhere else to rehearse. Instead of sending them home, Sarah made a call to the community center. Within minutes, arrangements were made for the group to use the center's space for their practices. As she watched them pack up their equipment, laughing and thanking her, she thought about all the small moments of choice that made up a life, a career, a community. Back at the station, preparing to clock out, Sarah found a package in her locker. Inside was a framed photo from the airport that morning. Jasmine surrounded by her unusual extended family of officers, teachers, restaurant workers, and community members. Below it was a note in Jasmine's handwriting. Some people think change happens in big moments, with protests and policies and grand gestures. But now I know better. Real change happens in small moments, when one person chooses to see another person's humanity. That's what you did for me, Officer Mitchell. That's what we're all doing now, one moment at a time. Sarah hung the photo in her locker next to her badge and family pictures. Her daughter had asked her recently why she'd become a police officer. Looking at the photo, she finally had the perfect answer: to be part of changes that began with simple moments of choice. As she drove home under a sky full of stars, Sarah thought about Jasmine starting her new life in California, about Trinity beginning her journey with their program, about Marcus's growing confidence, and about all the other stories still waiting to unfold in the streets of Millbrook. The radio was quiet now, but tomorrow would bring new calls, new choices, new opportunities to build on what they'd started. Their story had never really been about just a white officer and a black teenager. It had been about a community learning to see itself differently, one interaction at a time. The city lights twinkled below as Sarah turned toward home, her badge catching the starlight. Somewhere in California, Jasmine was beginning her first night away from home. In Millbrook, Trinity was probably studying for her next math test. Marcus was likely adding to his environmental research. And in countless other cities across America, other officers and other teenagers were facing their own moments of choice. But here in Millbrook, at least, something had changed. Not everything, not yet, but enough to prove that change was possible. Enough to show that the space between fear and understanding could be bridged, one human connection at a time. And that, Sarah realized as she finally turned off her engine and looked up at the night sky, was the most powerful story of all.